My name is Aubrey Hale, and I'm 27 years old. If there is one truth that has shaped the entire architecture of my life, it's this. I grew up in a home where love was distributed unevenly, predictably, and painfully. I have a twin sister, Talia, my mirror image in the most literal sense, but the similarities between us ended at biology. Somewhere along the way, my parents quietly, firmly, and irrevocably decided that she was the daughter worth celebrating, and I was simply the other one. People assume favoritism in a family must come from a child being exceptionally talented or difficult or different. But that wasn't the case for us. Talia and I had the same grades, the same hobbies, the same school clubs, the same interests. We even tied for first place in a science fair once, and I still remember the way my mother pretended not to hear when people complimented me, redirecting all praise toward Talia with a bright, too-wide smile that felt like a slap. At the time, I didn't understand why she did that. Now I know better. I was the child she tolerated. Talia was the child she adored. The favoritism started small. When we got toys or clothes, Talia would always get first pick. Even if the items were technically identical, the colors weren't. Talia got the pinks, the blues, the prettier patterns. I got whatever she rejected. If I protested, I wasn't met with understanding. I was met with lectures about how I needed to be grateful, how my jealousy would take me nowhere in life, and how the gifts were exactly the same anyway. So why was I being a problem? I learned very young that voicing my hurt only made things worse. By middle school, Talia discovered the intoxicating power of attention. She drifted away from our mutual friends and joined the cool kids, leaving me behind like an old toy she'd outgrown. She mocked me publicly, rolling her eyes or making snide comments if I spoke. I learned to shrink myself, speak less, disappear whenever she entered the room. It was a strange relief to no longer be in her shadow at school, even if that meant being invisible. My friends accepted me easily without her, and for the first time I experienced a small, fragile version of peace. But at home, nothing changed. Talia remained the sun. I orbited quietly at a safe distance, burning when I got too close. By high school, the gap between us had turned into a canyon. She was meaner, sharper, more entitled. I became quieter, more guarded. We lived in the same house, but in completely different worlds. Sometimes I would find her laughing with our mother in the kitchen over something trivial hair dye, a new manicure, a new jacket, and I would feel something in my chest cave in like a small implosion no one could hear. I envied her ability to walk through life with certainty that she was loved. I envied the security she moved with. I remembered once, maybe I was 13 when I broke down sobbing in front of my parents because I felt so overlooked. That memory still stings. They looked at me as if I had personally inconvenienced them. They told me feelings weren't facts, and that Talia didn't get more love, she simply earned more attention by being easier to deal with, easier to get along with, easier to understand. I internalized those words deeply. I wasn't easy. I wasn't understandable. I was the complicated one, the difficult one. When college application season came around, I poured myself into my essays. Writing felt like the only place I existed fully. My voice mattered on a blank screen in a way it never did in my own home. My friends encouraged me. My English teacher told me my draft was one of the strongest she'd ever seen. It was the first time in a long time I felt proud of myself. Talia, meanwhile, was strangely confident. She barely worked on her essay. Every time I asked her about her process, she brushed me off. I thought maybe she didn't care about college, or maybe she'd already made her peace with attending a local school. I didn't pry. I should have. Weeks later, results were released. Talia got in. I didn't. It didn't make sense. My hands trembled as I read the rejection email, my heart pounding painfully in my chest. Something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the dread curling through me. And then by a mix of luck, suspicion, and sheer desperation, I discovered the truth. Talia had stolen my essay word for word and submitted it as her own. I confronted her. She looked at me with cold, smug eyes and didn't even deny it. That moment broke something inside me that had already been cracked for years. It was like staring at a stranger wearing my face. I knew telling my parents would be pointless. They would find a way to blame me for creating drama. So I did something I had never done before. I fought back. Quietly, strategically, and without guilt. I reported the plagiarism to the university, attached my original drafts, and explained everything. I didn't embellish. I didn't cry. I didn't ask for anything. I simply told the truth. The university responded swiftly. Talia was blacklisted. She sat reading the email, stunned into silence. The hate she directed at me in that moment was so intense I felt physically cold. And yet, I felt a flicker of triumph. Not joy, just the sharp satisfaction of the truth finally having weight. I hoped foolishly that my parents would see what she'd done. For once, I wanted them to defend me, or at least acknowledge the damage she'd caused. Instead, they exploded. They screamed at me for ruining Talia's future, for going behind their backs, for being vindictive. They called me selfish, dramatic, ungrateful, every word they'd ever used to shrink me thrown at me like knives. They didn't care that she stole my work. They cared that I refused to stay silent. That was the night I realized something that would change my life forever. No matter what Talia did, she would always be protected, and no matter how deeply I bled, I would always be blamed. The months that followed were suffocating. I counted down the days until I could leave for college. When the day finally came, I hugged no one. I packed my things quietly, stepped out the front door, and didn't look back. And that was the last time I saw Talia as anything other than dead to me. But I had no idea that the real betrayal, the one that would break me completely, was still years away, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. Leaving home felt less like a transition and more like a jailbreak. The moment the bus pulled away from my parents' house, I felt something loosen inside me, something that had been clenched so tightly for so long that I no longer recognized myself without the tension. I didn't cry. There was nothing and no one worth crying over. Instead, I let the air fill my lungs as if I were breathing properly for the first time. College was exactly what I needed. It was noisy and chaotic and full of strangers, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, there were no shadows to shrink under, no comparisons to fail, no hostility simmering under every conversation. I made friends quickly. People seemed drawn to my dry humor, my quiet resilience, my willingness to listen. I felt myself expand piece by piece into someone who wasn't defined by Talia's orbit. And then I met Matthew Walker. Matthew was a senior when I entered my freshman year, warm, grounded, and genuinely kind in a way that didn't feel performative. He had this calm presence that made rooms feel less sharp, less dangerous. He belonged to the same friend circle I eventually drifted into, and he always made a point to include me in conversations, even when I mostly listened and observed. At first, it didn't occur to me that he liked me. I'd spent my whole life standing next to someone who was more charming, more adored, more wanted. It didn't cross my mind that someone could look at me and see anything worth wanting. But Matthew saw me. We spent late nights talking after study sessions. He walked me back to my dorm without asking. Sometimes we'd end up sitting on a bench outside the library watching students rush around us while he listened to me talk about my dreams, my fears, my writing, my childhood. I'd never told anyone the full extent of what Talia and my parents had done. But with him, the words came easily. He believed me without hesitation. His face would twist with disbelief or anger as I detailed the years of favoritism, the gaslighting, the plagiarism incident. "I don't understand how parents treat one child like that," he said once, his voice quiet but firm. "It's cruel. You didn't deserve any of it." Those words stayed with me longer than I expected. Matthew came from the kind of family people write greeting cards about. His parents were still deeply in love, the kind of couple who danced in the kitchen while dinner was cooking. He had 3 siblings, 2 sisters, and a younger brother, and they were all close supportive, annoyingly wholesome in a way I found both charming and painfully foreign. They welcomed me into their circle like I'd always belonged there without hesitation or judgment. I envied that world. I envied the ease of it. The way his mother hugged him whenever he visited, the way his siblings teased one another without cruelty, the way everyone seemed to know how to love each other without it tasting like punishment. Matthew and I were friends for 2 full years before he finally asked me to be his girlfriend. He confessed he'd liked me almost from the moment he met me, but he was terrified of ruining our friendship. I laughed half flustered and half relieved because I had been falling for him too quietly and cautiously. Our relationship felt natural, like a puzzle piece slipping into place. We already knew each other so well that the transition from friends to partners was seamless. We communicated easily, respected one another's space, and genuinely enjoyed our routines together. Morning coffees, weekend road trips, nights spent watching movies, while I laid my head on his chest and he stroked my hair absent-mindedly. I told him early on that I was very low contact with my parents and absolutely no contact with Talia. I explained everything, not just the plagiarism, but the years of neglect and emotional manipulation. I told him firmly that nothing could ever convince me to repair that relationship, and I needed him to understand that if he saw his future with me. He promised he did. He promised he respected my boundaries completely, and I believed him. Maybe I shouldn't have. For years, things were good. We had disagreements, nothing major, mostly stress or miscommunication, but we always found our way back to each other. I trusted him in a way I'd never trusted anyone before. I let him into parts of myself I had never shown anyone. He felt like safety. 2 years ago, when I was 25, he proposed. I remember the way his hands trembled slightly when he opened the ring box, the way his voice cracked, as he told me I was the person he wanted to grow old with. I said yes, before he even finished the sentence. He cried. So did I. It was one of the happiest moments of my life. His family was ecstatic. His mother hugged me so tightly I could hardly breathe. His younger sister squealed and begged to help with wedding planning. Even his father, usually stoic, shook my hand with a proud smile. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I finally had a family that cared for me, one that I hadn't been forced to fight for. But weddings have a way of peeling back the pretty layers. They magnify flaws, amplify tensions, and reveal cracks no one noticed before. As the planning months stretched on, Matthew and I began to argue more. It wasn't catastrophic, just stressful guest lists, budgets, opinions from every direction. But there was one argument that changed everything. I wanted a small, intimate wedding. Matthew wanted a large one. Extended family, close friends, colleagues, distant relatives, everyone. I didn't have any family I wanted to invite, and he said he understood, at first. Then slowly I noticed hesitation in his voice, a tension behind his eyes. One night I asked if something was wrong. He looked at me carefully and said, "Aubrey, I think you need to invite your parents." I froze. I reminded him of everything I'd told him, everything he had agreed to, every boundary I had explained. He tried to reassure me, saying it didn't mean reconciliation. It was just for the wedding, and that a wedding without family would send the wrong message. I should have listened to my instincts then. I should have asked myself why his perfect family's image mattered more to him than my lived trauma. But I didn't. I loved him too much, and love makes fools of all of us. We fought for days. I stopped speaking to him at one point. The tension was unbearable. Finally, he admitted the real reason he didn't want his extended family to think he was marrying a woman with no family values, and he worried it would reflect poorly on me. Poorly on me. As if the abuse I endured was my shame to carry. That conversation should have been my first warning. Instead, it became the foundation for a compromise I would later regret with every fiber of my being. I told him I would invite my parents. Only my parents. No extended family. And absolutely no Talia. He agreed. He shouldn't have, and neither should I, because what happened after that would unravel my entire life. Inviting my parents felt like breaking a promise to myself, a boundary I'd spent years building stone by stone. But Matthew seemed relieved once I agreed, as if the problem had been solved rather than merely postponed. He didn't fully grasp what it meant for me to reopen that door, and a part of me resented him for it, though I kept that resentment buried under layers of rationalization. I told myself this was what compromise looked like. This was what love required. This was what adults did in relationships. Still, even after we agreed, anxiety wrapped around my ribs every time I imagined calling my parents. I kept putting it off, hoping my hesitation might make the whole thing unnecessary. But with 6 weeks left before the wedding, I forced myself to pick up the phone. When my parents answered, they reacted exactly as I feared they would. Dramatic gasps, a gush of self-righteous commentary about how of course they would attend, and immediate assumptions that my entire extended family would be invited as well. I cut them off sharply and told them it was just the two of them. No cousins, no aunts, no uncles. And absolutely unequivocally, under no circumstances, no Talia. I said her name like a curse. My mother immediately scolded me, insisting that a wedding was the perfect time for the family to heal old wounds. My father chimed in that I needed to stop being a child. Typical, predictable, exhausting. I reminded them that I hadn't asked for their opinion, and that if Talia showed up, I would escort them out myself in front of everyone. They didn't like that, but I hung up before they could launch into a speech about forgiveness. I should have known then they were already planning something. A week before the wedding, they flew into town. They wanted to give me something and asked that Matthew come too. Everything about their tone felt wrong, slippery, manufactured. I didn't want a scene so close to my wedding, but Matthew insisted it was only fair to meet them. He promised that if anything went wrong, we would leave immediately. His confidence in his ability to keep me calm irritated me more than it reassured me, but I agreed. We pulled up to the hotel lobby where they were staying. I remember Matthew holding my hand, his thumb rubbing circles across my palm, a gesture meant to soothe me. Instead, it made me feel like a child being coaxed into a dentist appointment. We walked into the lounge area where they were waiting. And that's when I saw her. Talia, my twin, my mirror, my ghost. She stood when she saw us, her face arranged into a soft, apologetic expression that didn't match the venom she'd shown me our entire lives. My stomach dropped so sharply I felt dizzy. My parents smiled like this was some sentimental reunion, as if they had orchestrated a moment of familial healing, rather than a violation of the clearest boundary I had ever set. I couldn't move at first. My legs felt rooted to the floor. Matthew hesitated beside me, unsure whether to sit or pull me away. My parents immediately launched into a rehearsed speech about family unity and healing and letting go of the past. Talia pretended to wipe a tear that I'm sure wasn't real. I stared at her and saw nothing but manipulation wearing the costume of remorse. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. The ambush felt suffocating. Matthew finally sat clearly uncomfortable but willing to hear them out. That hurt more than anything. He looked between all of us as if this situation was simply awkward instead of traumatic. I watched his face carefully. There were moments fleeting but unmistakable when he softened toward Talia's performance. A nod here, a frown of sympathy there, a slow, uncertain exhale. It felt like betrayal in its earliest form, a foreshadowing I didn't recognize yet. I stood abruptly, grabbed Matthew's arm, and told him we were leaving. He resisted, whispering that maybe it was better to talk this out. Hearing him say that, him felt like the floor tilting beneath me. I yanked my hand free and told him he could stay and play happy families with them if he wanted. Then I turned and walked out. I felt his hesitation behind me like a slap. I checked into a hotel on the other side of town, sent him a message telling him where I was, and then shut off my phone. I drowned half a bottle of wine and passed out on the bed fully dressed. The next morning, I expected at least a message or two from him. In our entire relationship, Matthew had never been someone who gave space. He always wanted to resolve conflicts immediately. But when I turned on my phone, there were no missed calls, no texts, nothing. I called him that night, straight to voicemail. At first, I told myself he was giving me space because he felt guilty. Then I wondered if he was angry. Then I wondered if he had stayed with my parents and Talia after I left. The possibilities hollowed out my chest. By the third day, the silence became unbearable. By the fifth day, I realized something was very wrong. By the sixth, my hope had eroded. On the seventh day, our wedding day, I called the caterer and canceled everything. I blocked Matthew on every platform. He had ghosted me a week before our wedding. I spent the next weeks in a kind of emotional coma, breathing, but not fully alive. I stayed with a friend until I gathered the strength to return to my own apartment. I boxed up the wedding decor, the invitations, the gifts. I hid the dress behind winter coats. I tried to scrub him out of my life, but the ghost of him lingered everywhere. And then 2 months later, the truth arrived like a knife through my sanity. He had married Talia. On the same day he was supposed to marry me. I found out through someone who knew someone who'd seen pictures Talia dressed in white. Matthew beside her looking hollow and distant but unmistakably present. My own wedding date. My own venue decorations still half repurposed in the background. I felt my mind fracture and reform around the pain. All the old wounds from childhood, the rejection, the favoritism. The gaslighting roared back like a fire being fed oxygen after years of smoldering. Talia had won again, or at least that's what it looked like. But the truth, real, complicated, catastrophic, was still waiting for me buried beneath layers of lies, shame, and manipulation. I simply didn't know it yet. A full year passed before anything shifted again. A year of rebuilding myself from the rubble Matthew and Talia left behind. A year of forcing myself to eat, forcing myself to get out of bed, forcing myself to relearn how to breathe without my chest tightening at the sound of their names. Pain can be an astonishingly efficient sculptor. It carves you down to the bone and then demands you decide what gets built back up. I rebuilt slowly, quietly, without witnesses. I cut off all contact with my parents and blocked Talia long before she ever had a chance to gloat. The few mutual acquaintances who tried to update me about the wedding or Matthew's new life were removed just as quickly. I worked late. I focused on my career. I nurtured the friendships that had stood by me through the worst of it, and I let myself become someone new, someone tougher, someone calmer, someone who no longer needed to be chosen to feel whole. I wasn't healed, not completely, but I was standing again. Then, yesterday, while I was sipping coffee at my kitchen table and going through emails, my phone lit up with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I ignored it. They called again and again. On the fourth attempt, something in me tightened, a sensation like a warning bell ringing just beneath the surface. I answered, "Aubrey." The voice was fragile, trembling, desperate. I recognized it instantly. Nancy, Matthew's mother. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as if my body instinctively understood that this was not a normal phone call, that it was the kind of call that arrives like a shadow after the sun disappears. She was crying before she even finished saying my name. Her voice kept breaking the words tangled between sobs. She begged me to meet her, begged me to hear her out, said she wouldn't be calling me unless it was urgent. Pain laced every syllable, but I had no desire, none at all, to reopen the old wounds that had finally calloused over. "I don't want to meet," I said, my voice colder than I expected. "I don't want anything to do with Matthew or my sister. That chapter is closed." For a moment I thought she would back down, but her desperation only intensified. "Aubrey, please," she whispered. "There are things you don't know. You deserve to know. Please, please just hear me out. My son is—" She swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence. "I can't do this alone." It was the word alone that made something in me twitch. I wasn't heartless no matter what anyone thought. And Nancy had always been kind to me. She had hugged me like a daughter the night we celebrated my engagement. I could still remember her warm smile, the joy in her eyes when she welcomed me into her family. But mixed with that memory was another, the moment she learned Matthew had married Talia. The way she avoided my messages. The way her entire family went silent instead of demanding accountability from him. They had retreated into their house of shame, leaving me outside in the cold, bleeding. Still, there was something in her voice now that didn't feel manipulative or rehearsed. It felt broken. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. We chose a small cafe tucked away from the main street, the kind of place where no one would recognize us or overhear anything. Nancy was already seated when I arrived, wringing her hands together so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes were red and swollen, the skin beneath them sallow and tired. She looked older than I remembered, exhausted, in a way that went beyond lack of sleep. "Aubrey," she breathed when she saw me, as if relieved I hadn't changed my mind at the last second. I sat. I didn't speak. She dove straight into the past year. No easing in, no small talk. Just raw, exposed confession. She told me that after I stormed out of the hotel a year ago, my parents and Talia had cornered Matthew. They fed him a carefully crafted story about my childhood, an inversion of reality, where I was the problem. I was the jealous twin, I was the manipulative one who fabricated stories for sympathy. They told him that my no-contact stance was an overreaction, the result of mental instability. They painted me as volatile, dramatic, and prone to exaggeration. And he believed them. Not because he thought I was unstable, Nancy insisted, but because Matthew came from a family that sincerely believed conflicts could be solved through communication. It blindsided him that I had refused to stay and talk. He panicked when I disappeared that night. He took my silence as confirmation that I was in the wrong. And when the caterers called him to confirm the cancellation of the wedding, he spiraled. According to Nancy, he went to my parents for guidance, something he should never have done. Instead of telling him to slow down, breathe, or wait for the truth to surface, my parents offered the most catastrophic suggestion imaginable: he should marry Talia in my place, to avoid humiliation. I stared at Nancy as she said it. She could barely look at me. "He was out of his mind with shame," she said, her voice shaking. "Everyone in our family told him it was a horrible decision. We begged him to call off the wedding instead. But he was afraid. Afraid of being abandoned, afraid of looking foolish, afraid of making the wrong choice. And he let your parents, those horrible people, convince him that marrying your sister, even temporarily, was better than calling off the ceremony." She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "Aubrey. He thought he would fix everything afterward. He believed Talia would agree to an annulment. He never ever intended to stay married to her." My chest felt tight, my pulse thundering in my ears. Rage and disbelief and a bitter, exhausted sadness churned together in my stomach. But Nancy wasn't finished. "Talia never planned to let him go," she whispered. She told me that Talia had clung to Matthew, instantly declaring herself in love with him. She pressured him, threatened emotional fallout, and manipulated him in ways that mirrored her childhood tactics. Weeks turned into months. She refused an annulment. She threatened him with alimony, with public humiliation, with career damage. She twisted every knife she could find. And Matthew, already drowning in guilt and shame, stayed silent. Then Nancy told me the part that made my breath catch in my throat. Talia got drunk a few days ago, she said quietly. And she confessed everything. The lies, the manipulation, the essay she stole from you. She told Matthew that your parents orchestrated everything. She bragged about it, mocked him for believing her. She said he was a fool for trusting your family over you. Nancy's voice cracked. He hasn't been home since. He disappeared for days. He told me he ruined everything, that he broke the only good thing he ever had. He said he didn't deserve forgiveness, but he still wants to talk to you, just once, to apologize, to explain, to... I cut her off. No. The word was sharp, immediate, final. Nancy's face crumpled, as if I had physically struck her. She begged, her voice trembling. Her hands clasped together, tears spilling down her cheeks. She pleaded for me to reconsider, to meet him once, to give him the closure he needed. But I remained unmoving. I told her I didn't care if he regretted everything. I didn't care if he was falling apart. I didn't care if his marriage was a hell of his own making. He had made his choice. He had sided with my abusers. He had thrown me aside, and I would never ever re-enter the disaster he'd created. I left her there, in that cafe, sobbing into her hands. Later that night, she sent message after message. Her desperation seeped through every word, but I didn't open any of them. I blocked her number the same way I had blocked his a year earlier. For the first time in a long time, when I closed my eyes that night, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Not peace, not yet, but certainty. A certainty that I had finally severed the last remaining thread connecting me to that disaster. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly know, was that the fallout had only just begun. The hours after I blocked Nancy were unnervingly quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see if I would crumble or stay standing. But I didn't crumble. I didn't even tremble. If anything, a strange calm began settling over me like dust, finally drifting to the floor after years of chaos swirling in the air. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their mistakes. I wasn't pleading, explaining, or trying to save anything. I was simply done. And being done was more powerful than I had imagined. Over the next several days, I moved through my routine with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I woke up early. I drank the same coffee I always drank, but it tasted different, lighter somehow. I arrived at work before anyone else, lost myself in spreadsheets and meetings, and realized that the parts of my life untouched by Matthew and Talia were thriving quietly in the background. I had been so consumed by the wreckage they created that I hadn't noticed how much I had built for myself. I had a promotion coming up. My manager hinted at it weeks ago, and I had dismissed it as wishful thinking. But now it felt real. I had friendships that had grown deeper, people who had held me together when I was breaking apart. I had routines that soothed me, books stacked on my nightstand, plants I kept alive, despite forgetting to water them, and a small apartment that smelled like fresh paint and lavender whenever I opened the windows. It was a simple life, a quiet life, but it was mine, and it was enough. Still, even with all that progress, intrusive thoughts crept in, sometimes mostly at night. I would lie awake wondering if refusing to meet Matthew made me cruel, if blocking Nancy made me heartless, if a person could heal while stepping over someone else's grief, even if that someone had helped cause all the pain in the first place. But every time guilt tried to root itself in me, I forced myself to revisit the timeline, not selectively, not romantically, but honestly. I remembered the ambush at the hotel, Matthew's silence the week before our wedding, the cancellation calls he ignored, the photos of him standing beside my sister at the altar, my altar, while I sat alone weeping into my friend's arms. And I remembered the crushing, suffocating darkness that followed. I rebuilt myself alone, piece by piece, without a family, without a fiancé, without a lifeline. Matthew, on the other hand, made his bed surrounded by people who loved him. He had a mother who adored him, siblings who would have walked through fire for him, and a safety net I could only envy. And still he listened to strangers believed liars and walked willingly into the arms of the one person who had spent her whole life trying to destroy me. No, I wasn't cruel. I was justified. A few nights later, I found myself journaling something I used to do in college but had abandoned after the engagement. I wrote about Talia's confession, about Matthew's spiral, about the karmic symmetry of it all. I wrote about how, in some twisted cosmic way, life had balanced the scales. I wasn't happy he was suffering, but I wasn't sorry either. The pages filled quickly. Anger poured out. So did grief and relief. So much relief that I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding the past against my body like armor. By the time I closed the journal, my hands were trembling, but my heart was steady. The next morning, I woke up lighter. That week, I made small changes. I rearranged my apartment, moved my bed to the opposite wall, added warm lights in the living room, and threw away several storage boxes of old things I'd convinced myself I needed to keep. I found the box that held what was left of my wedding, an invitation, a hairpiece, a receipt for the dress alterations, a handwritten note from Matthew telling me how excited he was to marry me. I burned the note in my sink. It curled and blackened until it became nothing but ash. I didn't cry. One evening, just as I was settling on my couch with a bowl of soup and a mindless TV show, there was a soft knock at my door. It wasn't loud or frantic, just cautious, hesitant, like someone unsure whether they deserved to be there. My heart stilled. For a moment, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. But when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. The hallway was empty. I opened the door anyway, and that's when I saw it, a plain envelope on the floor. No name, no return address. Just a neatly folded piece of paper inside, written in handwriting I recognized immediately Matthew's. It said only one thing. I'm sorry for everything. Nothing more. No explanations, no pleas, no attempts at redemption. Just a single sentence. I stared at it for a long time. The words didn't sting the way I expected. They didn't reopen old wounds. They didn't make me want to call him or hunt for closure. Instead, they felt like the universe handing me something delicate proof that I was right to walk away, that he finally understood the weight of what he'd done. That remorse had found him long after I stopped needing it. I tore the note cleanly down the middle, then into quarters, then into smaller pieces, until it was nothing but a scattering of paper in my trash bin. And as the last piece slipped through my fingers, something inside me finally unclenched. I don't know what will happen to Matthew from here, whether he'll stay trapped in that marriage or fight to free himself, whether he'll spiral further or seek help, whether he'll ever forgive himself. None of it matters anymore. His life is his own to repair or destroy. What I do know is this: I am done being someone else's collateral damage. I am done carrying the burden of their choices. I am done letting the past define me. For the first time, the future feels like an open door instead of a locked one, and I intend to walk through it without looking back.